All right, so welcome everybody. Welcome to my Witcher Q&A for Gen Con 2019. Glad to see everybody. Hope everybody had a reasonably easy time finding the place and everybody's having a good convention. I am a really conversational guy, so if you feel the need to say anything, scream anything, throw any insults, or compliment my beautiful beard, go ahead. I will take it in stride. So, in other words, feel free to shout stuff out. If it gets too loud, I'll take hands or whatever, but. So, where should we start?
New products?
Well, I can talk about Lords and Lands, so I'll start off with that. So we, as many of you probably know, we recently, or just, this Gen Con released Lords and Lands, the GM screen for The Witcher TRPG, which is actually kind of an interesting story because, originally we kind of thought about what we wanted to release after the core book, and kind of one of the sort of small projects that was just going to be a little thing that we were going to put out was a GM screen because it's tremendously useful to have. It's a fairly standard accessory for basically any table, and I had been using sort of these put together GM screens with print out piece of papers and Hammerdog screens and whatnot to run my games, and I figured hey, we're a game company, we could make a GM screen, so I wouldn't be using these, sort of thrown together ones. But I didn't exactly, I've never been a huge fan of just selling a GM screen with nothing else in it. So we sat down and worked on the small pamphlet for Lords and Lands and put together basically a small packet of sort of goodies for people who picked up the GM screen. A new race being halflings, which are particularly fun to run because in almost all ways they are pretty much halflings from Tolkien or any other sort of Tolkien-esque setting, except for the fact that they are inherently magically resistant, and nobody knows why. They just are. It might be that they came through the conjunction from a world that doesn't have magic, or perhaps a world that has a lot of ambient magic that they've become resistant to, or something of the like, but they just naturally have this sort of magic resistance that in the game kind of comes across as them having a fairly tremendous boost to their magic resistance, making them capable of being resistant to even the most powerful of mages' spells kind of at the later points of their progression. They're also excellent at athletics and notably good at throwing things, which is interesting. I guess kind of a reference to halflings with slings and things like that. We find, and I'm sure anybody who's read through the Witcher books, will find that while The Witcher is its own setting, Andrzej Sapkowski, original creator of The Witcher, loves to take little bits of things from different places and different fantasy settings. One of the weirdest things about writing this game is that we realized early on that most of the language references are from other real-world languages. Things like the Elder Speech is primarily Welsh, with some Celtic and other sort of in that sort of Northern Europe category, and almost every named city in the Witcher world is named after a city in our world, and yet it is not technically an alternate reality or an alternate Earth, though I have a tremendously strange kind of headcanon about that, which if people are interested, I'll share.
Yes, please. Yes, let's do it. Well, this has something to do with like that idea with that's like the characters. I haven't actually played the games or anything, but there was something I heard about one of the characters traveling to a different dimension and basically describing cyberpunk. So connecting worlds to get that idea. So
Ciri does. Okay, it is not. It has not been confirmed that Ciri travels to the world of cyberpunk. I would imagine that was sort of a very obvious Easter egg that they decided to put in there. I don't expect those, because they've come out and said, I don't expect those two things to be linked. But we do know that also Ciri, it's not mentioned, but in the book she probably travels to, I think, Venice during the Black Plague, which is where Catriona comes from. But the incredibly dumb headcanon I have is that if you actually sit down and look at the shape of the continent and the climates of the continent, because me and Lisa spent a ridiculous amount of time doing this, because there were a lot of countries that did not have anything about them. So we built it based on what we could tell about their geography and their climate and whatnot, which is a tremendously fun process. But if you actually look at it and you look at the sort of the strata and how society goes and the climate and the geology, the continent as it has been depicted by CDPR matches up surprisingly well against the west coast of America. You effectively have the far north, which is a effectively taiga or tundra-like environment, much like Canada, separated from the northern kingdoms by a series of mountains. Then you go down into the northern kingdoms, which have sort of middling temperate climate, bordered on one side by a large section of mountains, much like the Cascades, with a number of bays. And then you go down further, and the further and further south you go, the more and more tropical it becomes, until Mecht, I think, where you start seeing palm trees, much like Southern California. And then you get to this little curve at the very bottom of where we have seen Nilfgaard depicted. And then past the mountains on that side, you primarily have desert. So that's I don't think it actually is the west coast of America, but I've always been fascinated by the sort of interesting, coincidences, shall we say.
So I thought, and a stupid question to go with this.
Yeah.
That's also a similar climate geography to the east coast of Asia.
Interesting.
Is like Russia towards, unsurprisingly, other side of the ocean. But
yeah, well,
Nilfgaard's California?
Yes. Nilfgaard is California, and the I think it actually works out that the capital of Nilfgaard would be theoretically reasonably close to LA. Weird facts. I have to double check that one though. But that's my weird realization as I was going through this.
In this big case, function follows form. You have this, just the nature of the geography dictates some of the microclimate of the area. With mountains, almost always depending on the position of water based on the geography of the mountains, you end up with airflow. Heavy rains on one side as the air gets pushed up, and the leeward side ends up being a desert or a much drier climate. That's which is why it's the same way on the west coast of the United States or the east coast of Asia. Again, the tectonic plate, the Pacific plate is right there, bordered on one side there and the other side on the west coast.
Oh yeah.
And so that's why you see the same kind of thing appear on both sides, which is the plate edge.
Oh yeah. Believe me, I spent more time going over rain shadows and climates based on latitude and longitude than I would like to have.
Like with a really good time.
Yeah, well, I enjoy world building, so yeah, it's good for me. Anyway, I really should finish answering your question, and then all right. And nobles, the new profession brought in Lords and Lands, which I'm particularly excited about because they are the first time we really get to kind of dabble in characters who largely function by interacting with other characters. The noble is built to have some combat sections, as in one section of their tree they're the knight, and they can do some really cool stuff, including they have an ability called Chevalier, which allows them to make a bond with their horse or mount of some form that lowers the control penalty for the horse, which means they can do crazy horse stunts effectively. But they also have two other trees, one which allows them to kind of dabble in a number of abilities, the dilettante tree, and one which is the full-on leadership tree, where they get to have servants, and they get to eventually, I think my favorite ability I've ever written in the game, the estate, where at the very end of the leader tree, you get a summer home, and you can furnish that summer home with everything from barracks to torture chambers to gardens and things like that, and all of them have some boon or bonus that you gain from them. And there's also some fun new gear, interesting stuff like man catchers for primarily used in Nilfgaard for escaped slaves. The dreaded Lamia, which is the spiked whip, and another personal favorite, a vial of gutworm eggs that you can poison your opponents with. Go ahead, my man. You.
Sorry.
You had a question.
Yeah, sorry. What was your favorite? What monster are you? What part of the world, or besides the continent, are you hoping to write, like a book or something like that?
What part of the world am I hoping to, besides the continent, that I'm hoping to write information about? Okay, this is hoping to write, because we currently do not have any of that sort of stuff figured out. I have wanted to write a solid several pages to a source book on Zerrikania since I found out it existed.
Is that the one the school that made it?
Yeah, well, yes. We don't technically know that the School of the Manticore is in Zerrikania, but it is past the Korath Desert, so we have pretty much assumed. The only other place we can currently think of that it would be is in Hockland, which is the sort of Mongolian horse warriors who invaded the Northern Realms in the past and will invade again. Due to prophecy, but we've assumed they're in Zerrikania. But there's Sapkowski wrote Zerrikania as I almost every European fantasy story has some like place across the sea that's basically like Asia or Arabia or something like that, where you put all of the interesting stuff that you're not going to do in your core setting. So there's a lot of interesting stuff in Zerrikania that we can't touch currently because we haven't really been able to go in depth on Zerrikania. But yeah, I mean, gold dragons and tattooed warrior women and a matriarchal society run by a woman with a magic sword and, you know, all that stuff. I would love to dive into that, but the likelihood of that at the moment is not super high because, you know, we work with CDPR and we kind of, there's a certain amount of cohabitation in the setting that we do. That means that if we want to, like, for instance, write like 200 pages of new canon, we do have to talk to them about it, and that can be a long process.
Sort of like with Cyberpunk, how they had to go back.
Yeah.
I'm sure some of this is public record, but I'm curious about your experiences cooperating with CD Projekt Red, because it seems like there's a back and forth that happens.
Well, I'm going to talk regarding Witcher at the moment. It was an interesting process to work with CD. We had a bit of an unfortunate situation in that while we were working on Witcher, they were also working on Witcher, but in a different way. So they were very, very busy. Most of what it came down to was, I've told this story a million times on a million interviews, but it was always it has been sort of this situation of working stuff out and then going back to CD with questions and talking to their lore experts and getting everything sorted out, you know, we realized we kind of had to do that early on, because when we first started into the project, I wrote most of the game based on Witcher 2, because Witcher 3 hadn't come out at that time. So consequently, when Witcher 3 came out, I had to rewrite like a third of the system because I wanted to match it to Witcher 3, because, you know, that was that gave us a perfect time period, and, you know, has some things have to change based on that time period, and, you know, B, I wanted to at least, you know, make an attempt to represent the stuff that you saw in Witcher 3, because, you know, that was what everybody was going to be playing at that moment. But we realized after that sort of snafu that we definitely had to be in more contacts. And I remember, you know, earlier on, Lisa and I got together and we were reading through the books and you know, going over the games, and I compiled like a 40 or 50 question list of just like lore questions about the setting. Everything from like in Witcher, spoilers for Witcher 2, in Witcher 2 when Philippa Eilhart ensorcels Saskia, we have the little joking reference of that as lesbomancy, but we never really know what it is. So I was like, what is this actually? What actually happened? Or, you know, my absolute favorite, which we laughed about for days, which was Sapkowski has a really interesting writing style, because it is incredibly evocative and it builds up a world really quickly. Just reading through a short story, he makes a million sort of one-sentence references, and that really allows you to feel like you're in the world, especially because characters will rarely explain something that they don't need explained. So all of the exposition is done as a character would need it to be done. But the problem is that leads to things like in the first story in Last Wish, which is the first short story collection. There was a scene where Geralt's in a tavern and somebody gives him hassle, and the book describes it as he casts a sign. We know that, but the book describes it as like he stands and he casts his arm out, and like the studs on his the metal studs on his gauntlet like glint or something, and like something happens to the dude. But it's never explained because nobody asks about it in the game. So we eventually figured out that was probably Ard, but not sure. And, you know, we got to the story, I forgot the name of the story, but it's this story in Last Wish where there are these elves up in the mountains, up in the Blue Mountains. They're raiding human settlements. It contains Teruviel, one of my most hated characters in the series. And they make one offhanded reference where they're in a field of hops, and Geralt and Dandelion are dealing with this satyr, and Dandelion goes, you know, in classic Dandelion fashion, Dandelion goes, Geralt, you know, use your magic on him. And Geralt goes, I can't, there's too many hops around. We establish in about 2 sentences that the presence of hops and hemp dampen magical capabilities. Which I then got to write, let's see, it was, if hops and hemp dampen magical capabilities, can a mage cast magic if they're drunk? If you throw a sheaf of hops and hemp on a mage, can they cast magic? If a mage winds up smoking hemp, can they cast magic? Like just like 5 questions all on this hops and hemp thing, and we kind of got back this response that was like, Sapkowski kind of writes things sometimes without thinking about it, so maybe we just ignore that part.
And actually, there's further complications because it's not just getting drunk. You can get drunk off of mead is the classic example of non-wheat fermentation of wine, for that matter.
Oh yeah, it's. I love Sapkowski's books. I think they're wonderfully written, but this project has truly shown that there's a difference between being a good writer and being somebody who writes something that can easily be transferred into a role-playing game. You need a lot of details to transfer something into a role-playing game because, you know, your players are going to want to do literally everything everywhere to everyone for every reason. You know, when I was writing, a little bit after I was writing the book, I had somebody who was asking whether we were going to have information on Zanguebar because he was running a whole campaign in Zanguebar. And, you know, I'm going, well, Zanguebar is mentioned like one time. We don't have any information about it. We know it's across the sea. You know, at the moment, it is probably much like perhaps Morocco or, you know, another North African country, and, you know, run from there, you know, because we don't know. We can only extrapolate until we, you know, actually sit down, you know, probably with CDPR and kind of go over what Zanguebar is like. You know, whether we hunt through materials that, you know, way past materials of the ones that we can use, because, you know, not every bit of Witcher material is applicable for us. You know, we've had a number of situations with that. For instance, we do not reference the old Polish comic books or the old Polish TV show. So there's some bits of that we can't reference that, you know, we have had people ask about. So it's kind of a weird situation. And I've entirely blanked on what question I was even answering at that point. But, all right. Well, I'm going to continue diving into it. If anybody has any questions, just raise your hand. So, oh, okay.
Just before I forget, I'd be remiss. Can you explain what the dabble skill is supposed to do?
Okay, I've heard there was some confusion on that one. The dabble skill is the first ability in the dilettante tree. With the dilettante, we wanted to basically give the noble a wide range of functional skills and the ability to take command of a situation by pretending they have a lot of skill in that ability, using little bits of information they've picked up as they dabble. Dabble was originally intended to, for every point you take, you get a small pool of points that you can utilize for skills that you do not already have points in. It was effectively designed so that you take all of your profession skills and, you know, any skills that you get bonus from your race, and then from there, as you put points in dabble, you know, you would split that pool of points among a number of other skills that you don't have points in. So you could effectively start to branch out to, when you had 10 points in dabble, you had, I think, like 20 points to go into skills that you knew, like you had 1 or 2 points in 20 new skills that you would not have previously gotten. I'm curious as to the. There's obviously a communication issue, so I'm curious as to where it is.
The way it's written now is just that you get 2 skill points for getting a level of dabble.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're spending 4 IP to get it to level 5,
Okay.
that could have been just spent in 2 different skills instead.
Okay, I see your point. We'll go through and look at that. Thank you for bringing that up.
Okay.
Oh my God, my phone. I am here. I am doing the thing I'm supposed to be doing. Okay. Yeah, we will look at that. Thank you for bringing it up. I really appreciate it. It's been some hectic times over at Telsorian. All right. I'm just going to dive ahead then. So, continuing on new products. Right now, I and our other designer, James Hutt, are hard at work on a product called Witch's Journal, which is going to be the first, but not last, bestiary for the setting. We are focusing on sort of less monsters with more detail than doing, you know, a huge list of monsters with little detail. So there are 33 new monsters. There are 3 from all 11 types of monsters. So you'll see, you know, new vampires, new specters, new cursed ones, things like that. Among them, we have Bruja, we have Rotfiends and Bulvor, we've got Bargeist, we've got Pesta, Plague Maidens, a lot of particularly fun ones, and after going through a lot of play testing on them, I'm very pleased that we've managed to get a lot of different monsters that feel like different monsters. I want to make sure that every monster that we put in the game was fought differently, or interacted with the players differently, or there was some different way to encounter it or deal with it. We have some in there that I'm excited about because you don't directly have to fight them. We have monsters that can pose tremendous threats. We have succubi, for instance, but you don't have to fight them to deal with them. They are sapient creatures. You can talk with them. You can perform verbal combat against them. You can bribe them, whatnot. And each of those gets their full spread, much like the bestiary in the back of the core Witcher book, with a bit better of a layout, so it's it's easier to just sort of immediately pick up what the monster can do, see where its stats are, run it as quickly as possible, and a good section of both commoner superstition and actual in-world legitimate lore about the monster. And then the ones I'm particularly excited about, which I'm still doing a little tweaking on because my gosh, they are difficult to figure out, is we have two monsters at the back of this book called, or as we refer to them, the exceptional monsters. And these are higher vampires and true dragons, which for anybody who knows the Witcher setting, I deeply hope that you know how difficult statting those creatures is. For those of you who don't know the Witcher setting, higher vampires and true dragons are considered exceptional monsters because they are among the most dangerous creatures in the entirety of the continent. True dragons, unlike draconoids, are, huge in scale. They are capable of breathing fire, some which will melt, stone and metal. Their claws, there's at one point in Thronebreaker, there's a scene where Cultullus, the red dragon in the Mahakams, swipes across a band of dwarves and just beheads 3 dwarves with one swipe of their claws. And higher vampires, on the other side, while they have no great size, they are so inhumanly fast that the most powerful among them, which we will not be talking about Unseen Elders, and I will explain why we're not talking about Unseen Elders, move far faster than Witchers, making them far, far, far faster than anything else. Their claws are capable of punching a hole directly through a person and out the other side, and each one of them has a unique, almost X-Men-like ability that is absolutely unique to that higher vampire. On top of that, they are immune to magical sensing, and they cannot die unless killed by one of their own. You can obliterate a higher vampire all the way down to a single atom, and it will regrow from that single atom unless you happen to be another higher vampire killing them. The reason we're not talking about Unseen Elders, who are the most powerful among the higher vampires, is because the Unseen Elders, the only Unseen Elder we see in the video games, which is the only place we see the Unseen Elders, moves so fast that Geralt is unable to perceive his movement. And at that point, we would have to give the Unseen Elders an attack value that was like plus 50. And that's kind of fun as a plot point, but not really fun to fight. So we will be alluding to the Unseen Elders, but not actually statting them.
I think it goes back to that entire idea of if it has stats, kill it. And so there's some places where, makes sense.
Yeah, the last Pathfinder game I ran, I had one of my players wanted to fight Gorham, the god of war, and I went and looked it up and specifically ran across an article written by one of the designers of Pathfinder who said, we're never going to stat the gods because they're gods, and you're not supposed to be able to fight them. So, besides the fact that you never see them, that's why we'll never stat the gods in Witcher. Well, almost never see them.
the whole thing with unkillable foes like a vampire, for instance, that you made is just that then you get people doing even worse things, like just finding a way to momentarily incapacitate or immobilize, and then just the mobility kill of encasing them in stone or concrete or something like that, and dropping them to the bottom of the ocean or putting them someplace else far away, and so they won't die. They can't die, but they're just going to hang out till past several mortal lifespans, and it's not your problem anymore.
We're very much planning on that for some of it. The only time I ran a test game for Witcher, the only time I had my players run into higher vampires, they basically knocked them down enough to get out of the area, and that's kind of immobilizing them or burning them up so much that they will take several months to regenerate is kind of the best way to deal with them most of the time. But then again, higher vampire society is kind of very very Venetian, very Italianate. So the likelihood that we're kind of planning, and we are going to be talking about if you bring a higher vampire into your game, unless you want them to be sort of in that uber villain category, don't just bring in one. Bring in higher vampire society. You can now put your players amongst a bunch of very powerful people who they can't necessarily kill any of them for good, but if you have, bards, mages, nobles, merchants, people who focus more on social aspects, you can wind up right in there politicking, and, you may not be able to kill the higher vampires trying to kill you, but you can make friends among the vampire society who they're not going to want to kill the other vampire because higher vampires have made an oath as a species not to kill each other. But you can convince them if you roll well enough or you give the right thing. So it's going to be interesting to factor those in, and mostly it's just been sort of a difficulty of making them feel as tough as they should feel while not making them so amazingly deadly that nobody wants to deal with them. Because at the end of the day, you should still be having fun while you're playing the game. That's kind of the point. But those monsters in particular, because we plan for them to be more sort of plot points. These are not things you have on an encounter table. You're not wandering through the forest one day and you encounter a true dragon. These creatures have their own life paths, where you will actually go through and generate the character of that specific dragon or that specific vampire. You'll go through, you can figure out, how they fight, what they like, what they hate, what their past has been like, that sort of thing, so that you can really sort of build a character around that, that monster, instead of just kind of throwing it out there just sort of as something for your players to fight, or, in a perhaps temporary roadblock, or in this case, reasonably permanent roadblock, depending. So we're actually pretty excited about that. We've had a lot of people testing out the life path and making a lot of vampires and a lot of dragons, and we've gotten to a point where people we've been testing with said that they've been creating a lot of interesting characters that they've used in their games, and their players have had a great deal of fun interacting with. So we're pretty happy with that.
You mentioned,
And then we'll go there.
Some people talking earlier, and I thought I'd bring it up from a functional standpoint,
Mhm.
about like the future of like demonstration games, of like getting the game shown to people,
Mhm.
and organized play, that kind of thing. Is that still in the works? Plans for it? Or been too busy writing?
At the moment, for organized play, we have been exceptionally busy writing. We are ramping up quite a bit, but at the moment the Witcher team is basically me, sometimes Lisa, and James Hutt sometimes. So we are looking into it. We have mostly been looking to see if there was a good level of engagement. We've got someone on actually our Facebook fan group who we are going to be probably sort of reaching out to, who has expressed interest in setting up some form of organized play. So I would say that at the moment we don't have any particularly official plans, though we are starting to do a bit of dabbling in organized play with Cyberpunk. We have a group here for this Gen Con who are running, I think they're running 30 Cyberpunk games at the convention. And they do a sort of large connected sort of Uber plot, more organized play-esque situation. They're not doing it this year, but
That's like the final form of organized play. Mostly it just starts with getting a good like roster or stable of introductory scenarios or one-shot con games for your system that people can play and have fun with, and eventually that morphs into like doing a living campaign or whatever. But yeah, okay.
well, if I might take a poll of the room, who here is interested in organized play stuff for Witcher? All right. See, because I can take this back to Mike and Lisa, and we can have a serious discussion about it. We've already been looking at putting up some more stuff in sort of support of Witcher on our website. So I will go back and tell them there's some serious desire for this.
What about adventure books or even full campaign?
We are working on an adventure book currently called The Witcher Book of Tales. That is what James Hutt is working on at the moment. It is going to be a 6-adventure book, unconnected adventures, sort of a small collection of adventures for you to run. And we do not have a direct release date for that, but that is in the works at the moment. We will likely be having some developers notes on our website in coming months regarding Book of Tales. James is excited to talk about it, and he's been doing a lot of good work on it. As far as campaign books, we do not have anything in the works at the moment. I have an idea for a campaign book that I might write, but we've currently got 3 irons in the fire for Witcher, one of which I can't talk about. So we kind of have our hands full at the moment. We may wind up looking to start setting that up, but I can't say anything for sure at the moment. Just that we have thought about it. Continuing on. Okay, time's doing pretty good. Another interesting thing that we're doing with Witcher's Journal is we are the actual product itself, Witcher's Journal. As much as possible, when I do material for Witcher, I like to kind of give it, in where possible, and especially with this product, give it sort of an internal fiction for the product. And a Witcher's Journal, as it is a Witcher's Journal, is the internal fiction is that is basically based on the journals of a Witcher from long ago, basically back sort of in the middle to late 900s of the setting, sort of like 60 or 70 years after Witchers have been created. And what we're doing with this is that we are actually going to be doing some writing in the book to kind of give people a bit of a feel for what Witchering used to be like, what being a Witcher used to be like, what the world was kind of like during that time period, and kind of give a feel for a setting that a lot of people have been very curious about, which is sort of the earlier days of the Witcher setting. There's a lot of, as anybody who's read the books or is kind of familiar with the games, there's a lot of timeline before the Witcher that we see in the games or in the books that has been kind of talked about, but never really expounded on. And there are a lot of people who have kind of asked us about that, and we're kind of interested to show a little bit of that ahead of time. And just kind of, to some extent, I want to gauge the reaction and see how people take to that, because that could very well be an interesting thing to dabble with in the future. So we'll be very interested to see the response to that section of it. And my time is running out. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to throw those hands up. There we go.
Since it just went on and I wanted to ask about it anyway, what other time periods in particular stick out to you as fun to play and fun to portray?
For me, there are two time periods that are particularly interesting to me. The first being in sort of this golden age of Witchers, basically very shortly after Witchers have been created, when people don't like them, but they have to deal with them. You know, there's still enough monsters that when a Witcher comes into your town, maybe you don't spit on him because there are still monsters in the woods that you need taken care of. It also allows us to deal with the political situation at that time period. One of the interesting things about that is that it allows us to deal with a time when Nilfgaard was not an all-encompassing empire to the south, you know, which is kind of interesting. We get to talk about all those kingdoms that are now kind of just vassal states of Nilfgaard that were not previously vassal states of Nilfgaard. One of the interesting things about the setting is that Nilfgaard actually has become a massive empire over less than a century. They have had some amazing expansion over the last few decades. And the other timeline that we probably won't really get to dabble a lot with, but I've always kind of thought was interesting, was the period right after the conjunction. Basically, you have humans, but they're not the most prevalent thing out there. The elves and the dwarves and the gnomes are still, you know, strong. They've still got their, you know, the elves still have all of their palaces, and the dwarves, you know, are not relegated to the mountains. The Vran, the lizard people, and the Boboak, the little beaver people, are still running around. They're not almost extinct. And just kind of dealing with taking more of sort of a non-humans encountering humans for the first time and encountering, for many cases, sort of magic for the first time. You know, the elves have magic, but not in the same way. And encountering monsters for the first time. So it's just sort of, to me, that is one of those time periods in history where, like, there is the most upheaval, and in many cases where there is the most upheaval, you can tell the most interesting stories. And I will take one more question, and then I gotta go.
So what's it like being the son of world famous Mike Pondsmith, you know, YouTube and internet meme god?
I get to tease Mike about being famous. That is like 40% of what I do.
I mean, since I've known him for about 30 years and knew him back when you were in diapers.
I learned a long time ago that my life is a measurement of time in the industry. Amazingly, people have stopped coming up to me and saying, "I knew you when you were this tall." Wow. Now they come up to me and say, "Wow, look how big he is. I feel old." But no, seriously, I've had an amazing opportunity to have a really good mentor for most of my life, and I'm really appreciative for that. And you know, I chalk a lot of my development up to the teachings that Mike and you know,
and
many
your
other,
mom.
yeah, Mike and Lisa and many of the people that I've met through Talsorian connections have taught me. All right, well, thank you guys for coming. I'm going to get out of here so the next panel can set up, and hope to see you all over at the booth if I haven't seen you already.